blessings I've had in my life is I've not ever had a drink of alcohol, and I hope I can keep it that way in my life, and keep on that great path, because that's a really good thing to be able to say. And I had parents that helped me with that, trained me in the right way to know that that's not something I should even be involved in. But that is a very big topic of conversation today in the church, more so than it might have even been 50 years ago. Is social drinking okay? And can't we just have a little bit of wine? And I think the biggest argument that they try to make is 1 Timothy 3:8. You have in there the scripture saying, likewise deacons must be reverent, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, and not greedy for money. Therefore, they come out and say, well, the deacons are allowed to drink. So obviously it's not a problem. So Wayne, what would you do if someone, one of your deacons suggests that they could have a little bit of wine, so as long as they're not given to too much of it?
Well, a couple things in that particular passage, and I would probably start with a question back to them. Well, what makes you believe that that's what he's saying? What's your understanding of that passage? Obviously, they're coming from a standpoint of this is what I want to do, and not necessarily because it's hard to bear out from the scripture itself.
Right.
And so, I'd want to know where they're coming from when they try to bring that up and say that it's okay to drink a little bit. Obviously, they're going to go to verse 8 and say, well, it says not given to much wine. They're gonna focus on that word much. But before we focus on the word much, I'd want to focus on the word likewise as the verse begins. Because what's he connecting it to? Well, he's just talked about the qualifications of elders. And we're looking at the qualifications of men, the characteristics of men that are going to lead the congregation. It said likewise. So of the same type of caliber and character of men are we looking for in deacons who are going to serve. And so that connection enjoins that qualification in a way that we're looking for the highest quality of men to serve in the Lord's church. And I think that's what Paul was trying to put to teach Timothy and his teaching. So because the argument has been made that because of much wine, then they are allowed to do a little bit. But here's a couple of thoughts. The word, as it's mentioned here in this particular passage, the word vigilant is used, the word sober, being sober-minded, and then not given to wine as it pertains to elders, and then not given to much wine as it pertains to deacons in that particular passage. Each word, though, has its own little reminder, if you will, of a life that abstains, a life that, and the word vigilant, and a life that is one of a sound mind, and one that is not even near wine, as it pertains to the way the word would be defined in the original, as it pertains to elders. And so, when you consider the language, to hold the mind to pay attention to apply oneself to give heed to, that's according to Strong's when we define that term. But in the original, it does not give the idea that one has permission to do it at all. There's no permissive side to this. This is one who is absolutely, completely staying as far away from as possible. And so, think about it for just a moment from the standpoint of some other passages, considering those words about abstaining, and these are not the only passages that are used that would show that idea of a Christian character as one that abstains from certain fleshly things and stays away and keeps his mind sober. Think about what the wise man Solomon, when he said, be not over much wicked. Would anybody in their right mind truly think that it's okay to be over a little bit of wicked, just as long as it's not much, as long as it's not too much, it's not, just a little bit? Well, that doesn't even make sense. We get that. I think we understand that. There's some other passages that remind us the same idea. Romans 6 and verse 3, we would also see, or 6:13 rather, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body, overtake your mortal body, reign in, rule over your mortal body, he says. Well, as long as it doesn't completely reign over my whole body, then it would be okay, right, to add a little bit of sin. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That goes completely against the character of those Christians that he's talking about in Romans chapter 6. because those who they have died to sin, remember, they've been freed from sin, so they no longer continue in sin. So then he says, don't let it reign over you. And so that idea, so we can see the folly that is in that. But in that same passage in 1 Timothy 3, the wives, who would, in my estimation, would be the wives of bishops and deacons. I think that the connection is seen there. You have the word that is the word vigilant, and I'm not going to try the Greek there, but the idea of being circumspect, the idea of being temperate, having self-control, all that, the same word are seen here, that they are to be sober in verse 11. And so that's a common thing that we see in both Titus and Timothy and 1 Thessalonians and 1 Peter. We see it. Peter talks about it as well. And alcohol robs one of such sobriety and sound mind and soberness, seriousness about their Christianity, I would say. I would begin there, having that conversation, and talk about the differences in that. How would you handle that situation?
I think there's some practical, just even in the text alone.
Yeah.
First of all, how do you know how much is too much?
Sure.
You're gonna have to sin at least once, because if you can't be given too much, well, the only way you're gonna know how much is too much is to go too far.
Right.
We talk about not going too far between a man and a woman before they're married. The idea of going too far is having sexual intercourse with one another. That's too far.
Right.
Well, then you have other people like, well, how far can I go before it's too far? And that question's asked. Well, if you have to ask that question about something, then you're admitting there's a problem with it. So the first thing I would suggest is, if you say that deacons are allowed to have wine there, then you're saying that God approves of at least one or a few times in your life of going too far with alcohol and sinning so that you can learn your limit. I don't find that in any other sin being approved of. You don't have God say, well, don't commit adultery on your wife, and then in the next breath he goes, but these men could commit a little adultery. Well, then how much is too much adultery? You have that problem of how much is too much. The second part is, this is a qualification of deacons. The elders are absolutely not allowed to drink wine. They're not given to wine.
Yeah.
That's understood. And I've never heard anyone argue that an elder can have it. It's always about the deacons. Well, typically what happens if you have good deacons in a congregation? They become elders.
Right.
That's the hope. Your hope and prayer is that your deacons, who are good servants in the church, could one day also serve as elders. And that's always a wonderful blessing that congregations have. Therefore, God's telling them to start a process that will be immediately sinful the moment they become an elder. Therefore, they're starting a process that will become a habit that they will have to break.
Right.
And that's always a difficult thing to do. Anything like an addiction, and alcohol can become an addiction. Pornography is an addiction. Drugs are an addiction. And I have heard people, some say, well, alcohol is not a drug. No, it is. It is a drug. We've stopped kind of calling it a drug because it's its own entity of drug, but it is a drug. Alcohol is very much something that can intoxicate one and cause them to do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Sure.
And it's just a different type of drug. But you're telling the deacons, go ahead and get started in this process, but the moment you become an elder, you're going to have to quit. You're going to have to quit doing what you've always done.
Right.
The influence of that is also difficult, because how can I look at a deacon who is given to wine and ever consider them to be qualified to be an elder when elders are not to be given to wine? They would automatically be disqualified in my mind by looking at them giving themselves to wine, because one of the very first qualifications we talk about with a deacon is, he's got to desire the work, but then we have what we might call big qualifications.
Sure.
And not given to wine is one of them. Husband of one wife is one of them. Well, if I look at a man and he's given to wine, I'm never going to look at him and say that man could be a deacon, because he doesn't fit the qualifications. Just like I don't look at a man who has a very big temper and suggest that he could be an elder, because the elders are not supposed to be soon angry.
Sure.
That is a qualification. And so I think just in the text alone, you have some logical arguments that can be brought forth. But I love how you brought out the other parts of the scriptures too, because that all works together. Obviously, like you mentioned, Ecclesiastes 7:17, no one's going to suggest that you can be a little wicked.
Right.
Can I cheat on my wife as long as I only do it a little? Can I hit my wife as long as I only hit her a little? Can I kill somebody as long as I only do it a little bit? No one's going to say yes to those things, because we understand it's not the quantity that we do it,
Right.
but that we do it at all.
Yeah.
And so with the deacons giving themselves to wine, there are three immediate problems to me. Number one, God's telling them that they can sin, and they're exempt from that. That's not found in any other place in the Bible. Right. Number two, you're telling me that they need to start a process that immediately becomes sinful the moment they become an elder. And number three, they will never become an elder in my mind because they will always be considered not qualified because they're given to wine. Therefore, we're going to really, really make a strain on our elder pool that we have.
Which we already have.
Exactly. Yeah. We've got a strain in the brotherhood on people in our congregations who could become elders because, like you mentioned, you hit the nail on the head. Paul is talking about not the best of the best, but the best of the best character. They're not better than anyone else in the congregation, but they have the best character.
Right.
And you need those men to serve. A preacher, while there are no qualifications necessarily laid out like this, they must fit these categories as well.
Sure.
Because how can they stand before the congregation if they don't fit the qualifications of an elder and a deacon? They have to be servants. They have to be leaders in the church. No, they're not an elder in some cases. Some they are. But they have to meet these qualifications as well. And so if we put that limit and say deacons can do it, then we're going to take an elder pool that might be here and put it to here, because all the men in the congregation who could serve as deacons will never be able to be serving as elders. And that would cripple the Lord's church. So just logically looking at it, it doesn't stand. It doesn't hold true.
Right.
And I mean, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Couldn't you imagine the situation where someone would say, okay, well, we're considering brother so-and-so who's serving now as a deacon, and so we need to go to him and let him know that we're considering him to be an elder now. He's going to have to stop drinking.
Right. Right.
It just doesn't make any sense to begin with, you know. Like you say, he wouldn't be considered to begin with, and I don't think he'd be considered to be a deacon. Obviously, he would be disqualified, and as I understand the passage. So, yeah.
And you know, the thing about this that really becomes a problem, and it's happened to people, we have people that they do this in secret. They socially drink in secret, and that seems like an oxymoron, you know, because there's nothing really social about it, but they recreationally drink alcohol. Maybe they have it, you know, once a night when they have dinner, or they do it this way or that way, or they do it for the antioxidants, as some people say. Problem is, we have a situation where you might go into someone's home to visit, and you say, hey, could I maybe snag a water out of your fridge? Would that be all right? And they say, sure, help yourself. Go on into the fridge. Maybe you're visiting, doing a gospel meeting, and you open the fridge and you see a 24-pack of beer sitting in there, or, you know, a 6-pack, or whatever you want to call it, or they've got a bottle of wine, or you open the freezer to get an ice cream sandwich out, you know, to enjoy a snack, and you see, you know, a bottle of vodka just sitting in the freezer. How do you handle that? What would you do if that happened to you?
Well, and I've been in a couple of those situations, unfortunately, you know, and you know, I've probably handled it. Maybe I've not always handled it the best, but you know, I think there again, we have to have a conversation with people. You know, we talk about these qualifications for elders and deacons, for their wives, but consider this also, that, you know, we're looking at the character traits of what we should all be striving to be. And so I would not think in any stretch of the imagination that would leave a Christian out, you know, not a deacon or an elder, we just say just a New Testament Christian, outside of that realm as well, where they could go and, okay, well, I'm not listed in this passage. No, you're listed in some other passages that teach against the evils of drinking alcohol, beverage alcohol. And so I would have that conversation with them. I think it's important to, you know, some people just have never heard of these things. You know, some places they don't preach against this. You never hear about it. You never hear these passages being taught. You never hear them maybe being taught correctly,
right?
Or just kind of, you know, observing the Passover, so to speak. You know, passing right over them as no big, as they're no big deal. We're going to get to something that's more important here when our society is drenched in alcohol. You know, in every TV show, every commercial, you know, you see it just all over the place, you know, but they fail to show you the problem with it, you know. I would have, you know, long before I have the conversation about it being sinful, I want to have the conversation, I think, about why are you doing this, you know, why are you, why do you have this in your house? I know individuals who've been, their business or their office or the you know, place they work for, you know, they were presented this as you a token of appreciation for whatever, you sold the most cars this year, so here is a bottle of wine for you, and they put it up, and it's kind of like a trophy, in their home and such, and I know a situation, where that was kind of the case, this was a military family, but it was they were given this, from folks in their squad, so to speak, and so they kept it around, but the moment they were asked about it, they realized this is problematic. This looks bad. They didn't drink it. In fact, I'd been there on several occasions, seen it, never had the top off of it, so I knew they weren't drinking it on a regular basis. But the fact that it was there, but I may make assumptions and assume that maybe they are drinking, but I don't know until I ask. But you're not going to, get anywhere unless you have the conversation. I think that some of the questions that we have, we fail to have communication with people, and we make assumptions about people, and that's never good. So have a conversation, ask them about it. Don't be fearful of the passages. I think the passages completely back up the fact that, that the Christians should abstain from beverage alcohol. I think it's the Bible, teaches that. Some unfortunately don't believe that, don't go that far, but we can have that conversation. We can sit down and study together, and I think that's our work, that's our job, that's what we do. We want to get to the Bible and what it says, and we want to help people have a better understanding and also have a better life. You mentioned antioxidants a moment ago. Some people say, oh, well, I do it for, the health benefit. The same health benefit in a bottle of wine is seen in a bottle of grape juice.
Absolutely.
And that's been proven over and over and over. So,
and while we would say, too, of course, 1 Timothy 5:23 was an exception made to the rule for Timothy's sake to have a little wine for his stomach's sake. Two things on that, just so we can cover it. Number one, Timothy somehow felt the need to ask Paul if that was okay, which tells me a lot right there.
Yeah.
And number two, God lifted that for Timothy, but it was with guidelines, a little wine for your stomach's sake. Today, we have medicines that do what that little wine would have done back then.
Sure.
Therefore, we don't have to worry about having a little wine. You mentioned the grape juice for the antioxidants. There are other things that the alcohol may do for the stomach's sake necessarily. Mm-hmm. But there are medicines today that can help with that. Therefore, a lot of doctors have even stopped prescribing that as part. I remember 15 years ago, actually probably longer than that now, my grandmother being prescribed on my mom's side, prescription wine. Now that was for a heart problem she had. Now that was back before we had some of the medicine we even have today. I have not heard any doctors today that would suggest that that's what they would prescribe anymore.
Yeah.
So we have to understand that medicine changes. And we have to know that while it was acceptable back then, I do believe it was alcoholic based on the context of the passages that were being in 1 Timothy 5:23, it was not for Timothy to get drunk. It was not for Timothy to socially drink, and it was not something that other people not named Timothy could do.
Right.
It was for Timothy and Timothy alone. We have these letters now, and they're all compiled together that make up the Bible, but this was a letter sent to Timothy that we have as part of our scriptures because of the way that it worked with, of course, GBI that we had at Memphis School of Preaching, where we learn how a book of the Bible even came into existence. Right. But when that letter was delivered to Timothy, it was for Timothy's eyes only, so to speak. Therefore, when he was told you can have a little bit of wine for your stomach's sake, that was a thing for Timothy to see. Just like if I wrote you a letter, right. Someone else can read it, but if I put in there, Wayne, I've left you $200, they're not going to sit there and suggest, hey, I get $200 from Michael. But we've had some people try to say, well, Timothy got to do it, therefore I can do it too. That doesn't stand. It was a specific thing for Timothy. And we talk about that with the apostles, in the Holy Spirit. We're told in John 14 and John 16 that Jesus is going to send the Comforter to them and that he will guide them into all truth and give them the answer when they need it. That's not a passage that applies to me. Just like Noah building an ark doesn't mean Michael needs to go out and buy some wood and get ready to build. So we have to put the right context on these verses as well. But I think the problem too is, you find something in the home, and you got to remember Galatians 6:1.
Sure.
In this moment, you have to understand that people can fall into a trespass unexpectedly. It's not, that word there is taken by surprise. They fall into a trespass. That's like a deer jumping in front of your car. That's the type of surprise I get in my mind, at least. You're not expecting it, and boy, does it surprise you when you see it. Well, when that happens, the text says, you who are spiritual, you restore such a one in the spirit of meekness. So you don't walk into the living room with that bottle of alcohol and say, what in the world is this?
Sure.
We're going to have a fight right now, because that's not the spirit of meekness. But I like how you put it, where you walk in there and you ask them, are you guys drinking that? I know some people cook with alcohol, and they cook it out and they do it that way, and it doesn't have any alcoholic effect after being cooked. But at the same time, it's like you mentioned with that military family, the influence is important. The influence can be everything, and we have to understand our influence does matter.
Absolutely.
But another problem has kind of surfaced in our world with our children. It was a big problem when I was growing up as a teenager, and I know you had 2 teenage sons. You still have one living at home.
Yeah.
This has probably been a problem you might have even encountered, where your children are invited to a non-Christian party where you're pretty positive alcohol is going to be present. What would you do if they're asked to go to that type of party?
Well, to begin with, I don't want my children around any of it.
Absolutely.
I've been around enough alcohol growing up myself to know what it brings, and the hardship that it brings, and the pain that it brings, and the inhibitions that are dropped around it. And I don't want my children around it at all. That being said, this kind of goes back to, in the rearing of children, is you start this conversation early. It's so important. By the time they're, going out the house, and would be invited to such a party as this, the conversation's too late to start having then. Not that, if you've never had the conversation, yeah, you got to start it sometime. But this is a conversation that needs to start much earlier, and having an expectation of what we expect in our home, and how we're, as the head of the house, I get to help lead in that, obviously, and bring, this is how we're going to run this household. This is what we're going to do here, and so we need to talk about it. But, family Bible study is important, and having these conversations and studies, as we've just kind of broke down some of these verses and talked about some of those words in there and defined them, and talked about the type of character that God's looking for in those who would lead, and talk about how this kind of thing can ruin the reputation of someone and cause them not to be able to lead, serve as deacons, or one day maybe an elder or something like that. And young men especially young boys need to think about that early on. Think about the possibility of serving as a deacon. Think about the possibility of serving as an elder. We spend a great deal of time training our young boys to learn how to preach sermons, because we want them to be preachers. We should also want them to be elders and deacons as well, and that's going to take the right kind of character. We need to teach them early. This can ruin your character. This is the kind of thing that can change the way people view you, whether inside the church or outside. You remember, elders have to have a good report outside the church as well. And so I think that that's important. But again, it's about communicating. It's about talking with your children about how are you going to handle that situation. And you can call me, maybe you didn't know and you showed up at this party, and that's the way that it went down, and all of a sudden somebody broke out one beer here, and all of a sudden you look around and you start noticing that's kind of what this party has become, and I don't need to be a part of it. I need to get out of here. And I know that I can call my parents, and they, without question, come and get me, and and maybe they're going to be upset with me for a moment in time that I ended up at this party and I didn't know that it was going to be this way, but we can talk about that, because we have that open communication in our family. But there again, I think family Bible studies where we're talking about these things, and that's the thing that I think that most people veer away from, is having these hard conversations with their young people, with their children, and it's unfortunate, but once they're there and in that situation, if we haven't talked about it, it might be too late for them. We don't want them to be around it. So,
and wine's a mocker. We know that.
Yeah.
Proverbs 20 and verse 1, and that word mocker there in the Hebrew, it gives off an impression, according to some definitions, of talking arrogantly.
Yeah.
And we have heard the statement before, get me some liquid courage.
Sure.
Because alcohol has a tendency to make people say and do things they would not normally have said or done. Yeah. And that's even in adult brains. When you have young children, like you had teenage sons, and now you've of course got one that's often married, but when they were teenagers at home, their brains weren't developed. And even for a boy, the brain doesn't fully develop till a little bit even later in life, after the teen, it's not fully done growing, and they're not fully done maturing. And you wouldn't give your child a shot of bleach and tell them this is good for you, and then say, well, why are you not doing well with this? Come on, it's fun. It's all good, clean fun, because we understand that that's poison.
Right.
But alcohol's been packaged in such a way that is pleasing to the world that will give them poison in small doses. And the fact of the matter is, we don't know how our bodies react to this stuff until we do it. And I think that's just it. If you were to tell me, I've got my disease that makes it difficult to eat certain foods. If you were to tell me, Michael, I want you to eat this. I don't know what it's going to do to you. It may really be a hard thing on your health, but I want you to eat this and just tell me what you think about it. My answer to you is going to be no. If you don't know what it is or what's inside of it, I can't eat it.
Right.
Because I have to watch what I eat because of my medical condition. I have another condition that's spiritual.
Yeah.
So I need to watch what I do to my spiritual condition. And therefore, when I go to a party, like you said, it may be like you show up at this party and all of a sudden these guys break out the alcohol and you didn't even expect it. I think I read on the internet a couple years ago that there was a particular teenager that he would send his mom a gigantic X anytime he was at a place where he needed to be picked up. And that was a sign for her that he didn't need to be where he was. And it was a understanding between the both of them. If you send that to me, I won't ask you questions about it. I'm going to come get you, no questions asked. That's impressive.
Yeah.
And that's a mother that understands and trusts her son. And that's a son in that situation that sends that to her and knows, hey, I have a way of escape here. I don't have to stay here. Sometimes we have the thing happen where the children are at this party and they're like, man, my mom and dad, they just got home. They probably don't want to come. And they feel like they're putting out their parents. But the parents are going to be more than happy to get in the car and waste some gas, and have to buy another tank of gas if even it took that to get their children out of a sinful situation. $20 at the fill-up station, the gas station, is going to be worth your child's soul. Absolutely, every time. I mean, it's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to, it's not going to be a thing. But we need to teach our children, like you said, when they're young, and it goes along with what I said in a previous conversation we had, keep yourself pure.
Right.
When you keep yourself pure, you don't have to worry. You can go to a party with your friends. If you're at a pure party and your friends break out the alcohol, you can know, you know what? I'm not going to do it. I don't have to stay. In high school, I had friends ask me, I said, you're not going to prom. Why are you not going to prom? I said, well, my understanding of prom is that you do a lot of things that you shouldn't do. And I said, I just don't need to do that. In this setting, in this context, I'm just fine not doing it. And I remember one particular weekend, a friend of mine at school said, what do you do for fun on the weekends? Because they would go out and get drunk and they would, get high, or they would go out and, commit intercourse with people. And all this stuff was going on in my high school. And they're like, what do you do for fun? And I go, I remember my weekends. I told them that. I said, I don't have to worry. I don't have to wake up the next day and wonder who I was in bed with last night, or, what did I do last night? What did I drink? What did I smoke? Am I clean? Do I have any diseases? Did I contract anything? Did I get anything from the alcohol, from the drugs? Did I do anything that's going to hurt? I remember my weekends. And when we have children going to these parties and they're put in this temptation, if we start them off young, we're going to help them in a lot of ways avoid a lot of heartache in their lives.
Absolutely. Great questions.
I know that my Redeemer lives. I know eternal life he gives. I know that my Redeemer lives.